Did you ever have to pretend everything was fine when it really wasn't?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? I broke every rule and won. My sister looked me in the eye a few hours before the party and said, without even lowering her voice, "You're not allowed to outshine me tonight." That wasn't the first time she had said something like that, and deep down I knew it would not be the last either, because that was how our relationship always worked. Vanessa set the rules, and I followed them. I used to believe that doing so kept the peace, that it was easier to bite my tongue than argue over every little slight, but the older I got the more I realized that the peace only existed because I was expected to stay invisible whenever she wanted the spotlight. For years my milestones were turned into her supporting material. When I got an award in high school for community service, she told everyone it was because she pushed me into volunteering in the first place. When I finished an internship, she described herself as the reason I landed it, because she helped me with my resume. Even when I finally got the acceptance letter into the adult degree program, the family group chat turned into Vanessa making jokes about how I was still in school, while she was already advancing in her career. I laughed it off because that was what the family expected of me, but it cut deeper than I let on. I worked full-time and studied at night for 4 years. It wasn't glamorous, and there were nights I could barely keep my eyes open in front of the laptop, but I was determined to finish. No one in my family ever really asked how it was going, not even when I hit honors-level grades. They just assumed I would drag it out or quietly give up, which was convenient for Vanessa because it meant she didn't have to deal with me having something that looked bigger than what she had. Then came her party. The timing wasn't accidental. It landed the same weekend as my graduation, and when I brought that up she said, "You can have your little ceremony in the morning, but the evening is mine." She said it with a smile like she was offering a compromise, but it was clear she expected me to be her background again. She told me outright not to wear anything that would draw attention, not to mention school, and to let her big news take center stage. My parents, as usual, encouraged me to just go along and be nice, because it's not worth the fight. So I agreed. I said fine. I even nodded calmly when she repeated herself on the phone that morning, like I was a child being reminded of the house rules. But what she didn't know was that for months I had been preparing to stop disappearing. I had kept every piece of documentation, every email, every program letter, every detail of what I had earned on my own. I had let her believe she still controlled the story, and the truth is that pretending to accept her conditions gave me more power than she realized. When I arrived at the party, the room was loud with laughter and chatter. Vanessa was glowing as she worked the crowd, introducing people and steering conversations like she was the host of her own show. She was already mid-sentence, telling someone how family was the key to her success, when I stepped inside. I wasn't in a cocktail dress like she told me to wear. I was in full graduation regalia with the honors cords draped across my shoulders, the ones she never even knew existed because I hadn't shared the news until that very moment. The shift was instant. Conversations stopped midstream, laughter trailed off, and heads turned. It wasn't planned as a dramatic scene, but the reaction was unavoidable. For the first time in years, the attention wasn't on Vanessa. My parents looked startled, like they weren't sure whether to be proud or worried. Vanessa froze for half a second before she plastered on a wide smile, the kind she uses when she's about to take control of a situation she feels slipping away. She walked over, hugged me with her arms stiff around my shoulders, and announced loudly to the guests, "I am so proud of my little sister." I basically coached her through this entire program, and look, she finally made it. That was her move, her reflex, the same one she always used. She could not stop herself from trying to turn even my moment into proof of her own influence. What she did not realize was that I had come prepared for that exact twist. I had quietly collected every receipt, every letter, every file that proved she had nothing to do with my degree. I had rehearsed in my head what I would do when she inevitably tried to grab the credit. And as she stood there smiling, convinced she had regained control, I felt calm. I knew exactly where I was about to take this. Can you guess what happened next? Vanessa's arm was still hooked around my shoulders when she announced to the room that she had basically coached me through the entire program, and even though she was smiling like she had just handed me a medal, I could feel the pressure of her grip digging into my collarbone, a silent reminder that I was supposed to let her rewrite the story before anyone had the chance to ask questions. In that moment, I had a choice. I could laugh politely, say thank you, and fade back into the corner as I had been trained to do since childhood. Or I could finally pull the first thread of the truth and let it unravel in front of people who had never once questioned the way Vanessa took credit for everything that passed through our house. I smiled at her, stepped out of her grasp, and thanked her for the kind words, but instead of stopping there, I turned to my parents and asked if they had opened the letter that came from the Scholarship Foundation earlier in the week. The room quieted, because no one knew what I was talking about. My mother frowned and said she had left a stack of mail on the counter, and maybe it was still there, but she hadn't looked. I pulled the folded envelope out of my bag and said, "Then let me share it with you now," and as I opened it, I could feel the attention in the room shifting, people curious in a way that made Vanessa's smile tighten just a little. The letter was short, nothing dramatic, just a formal note from the foundation thanking me for my service hours, my GPA, and my leadership in the adult student program, confirming that the award money had been renewed for my final year. I read a single line aloud, enough for the guests to understand what it was, and then I looked directly at Vanessa. "This," I said, "is how I paid for school, not coaching, not guidance, not family money. A scholarship foundation believed in me, and that is why I was able to stand here in these cords tonight." For a second no one spoke, and the silence was heavier than anything I had felt before, because it was no longer just between me and my sister. It was hanging in front of a room full of people who had always accepted her version of events without question. Vanessa laughed, that high laugh she used when she was cornered but pretending she wasn't, and said I must be misremembering, that she had helped me write the essay for that scholarship, that without her editing I never would have won. She even gestured at one of her colleagues in the corner and said, "You know how hard it is to win these things without professional polish." That was the moment I had been waiting for, because I had anticipated this exact claim years earlier when she first insisted on reviewing my essay draft. I pulled out a thin folder from my bag, one that had lived in the bottom drawer of my desk, and handed it across the coffee table to my father, who looked confused, but opened it anyway. Inside was the original essay, time-stamped, alongside the track changes version Vanessa had returned to me. Her edits were nothing more than a few commas moved around, maybe one sentence shifted, but the body of it, the argument, the voice, the substance, was mine, and the proof was sitting in his hands in black and white. I watched as he turned the pages, his face changing from confusion to realization, and then he looked at me as if for the first time he was registering that I had been building my own path without leaning on Vanessa the way everyone assumed. I didn't gloat, I didn't raise my voice, I just said, "I've kept the record because I knew someday I would need it." My aunt, who had been sitting quietly in the back, leaned forward and said, "And let's not forget that one semester when my credit card paid for your textbook after the store declined yours." That landed harder than I expected, because it showed that, even when I stumbled, the person who caught me was not Vanessa, but someone she barely acknowledged. The guests were murmuring now, whispering to each other, and I could see the cracks forming in the narrative Vanessa had crafted for years. She tried to rally, saying that family contributions come in all shapes, that guidance and inspiration were as important as money, but the more she spoke the clearer it became that she was scrambling. I let her talk, because every word only made my next move stronger. When the murmurs quieted, I asked one simple question, looking directly at my father, but loud enough for the entire room to hear, "Do you want to see the timestamps?" It was not a threat, not a performance, just an offer. My father hesitated, then said yes, and I pulled out the printed page of digital records showing the creation and modification dates. It was clinical, undeniable, and the weight of it settled over the room like a hammer without me needing to raise my voice. Vanessa's laugh faltered, and she waved a hand as if the whole thing was beneath her, but I could see the panic in her eyes. She wanted to spin it, to regain control, but for once the evidence was stronger than her charm. My parents sat stiffly, unsure how to react, while the guests pretended to sip their drinks, but were clearly listening to every word. I leaned back, calm in a way I had never felt before, and thought to myself, this is only the beginning. Because while the scholarship essay was proof of financial independence, it was only one piece of the larger puzzle I had assembled, and the part that mattered most was still waiting to be revealed. I had evidence that went far beyond a scholarship letter, evidence that touched her professional life, her career, and the image she guarded more fiercely than anything else. The cords around my shoulders were the start. The scholarship letter was the second step, but the move that would finally turn the tables completely was still to come. And as I watched Vanessa force another brittle laugh, I knew she had no idea just how far I was prepared to go. After the scholarship letter did its quiet work and the room adjusted to the idea that I had not been carried across a finish line by a generous older sister, but had walked it on my own legs, I could feel the air shift toward that uncomfortable place where people start reordering memories in real time, and in that shift Vanessa did the thing she always does when her authority is threatened, which is to double down on confidence and move the conversation into a lane where she believes no one can catch her. So she moved us to her career and told a small story about a recent client win, sprinkling in details about strategy and impact and efficiency with the casual certainty of someone who has never once imagined the words evidence and accountability landing in the same sentence as her name. I listened without interrupting because it is easier to let someone finish when you know what you are about to place on the table, and when she mentioned a data slide that had supposedly sealed the deal, a slide about conversion patterns over a quarter with a neat label and a minor spelling mistake that no one in her office had caught, I felt the quiet click in my head that comes when two pieces of a puzzle finally meet. Because the harmless typo she described was not random, it was the exact same stray letter I had left in a draft of my capstone dataset late one night when I was too tired to see straight, a mistake that survived into a version I saved but never published. And that meant the analysis in her deck had not merely been inspired by my work, it had likely been lifted from a file that existed only because I had created it and once, in an attempt to be generous, emailed her a sample to look at, months earlier when she had asked what I was learning. I do not enjoy accusing people of things, and I especially do not enjoy the feeling of accusing a sibling, so instead of calling her out in front of the guests, I took the route I had prepared for, which was to talk about policy in a tone that sounded like curiosity rather than attack, and I asked, in a voice that carried just enough to loop in the right ears, whether her firm had a rule about crediting outside contributors when internal teams referenced external data or analysis, not because I wanted to embarrass her, but because I wanted the conversation to move into a space where facts mattered more than charm. Mr. Carroll, who had been leaning against the doorway with the posture of a man who likes proof better than stories and who, according to family gossip, valued results above relationships, looked over at me and asked what kind of data I worked with, and I told him plainly that I had built a small dataset for my capstone on audience behavior, nothing proprietary, all public sources, but cleaned and structured by me with a few experimental labels, and that one of those labels had a small typo in an early draft that I had later fixed, which would be meaningless except that Vanessa had just described a client slide with the same typo, and coincidences do happen. But the timing and the phrasing and the shape of the charts made coincidence feel like a thin explanation. Vanessa laughed in that airy way that suggests we are all overreacting, and she said that trends are trends and everyone knows the same truths, and maybe I was being sensitive, and anyway she had never seen any of my files, which would have been more convincing if she had not, months earlier, asked me to send a peek so she could understand what adult programs even do these days, a request I had indulged because I was trying to be a supportive sister at the time, and because I was naive about how quickly a peek becomes a slide and how easily credit dissolves when it passes through the hands of someone who believes credit naturally belongs to them. I told Mr. Carroll that I was not alleging theft, that I was not looking for a fight, that I simply cared about accuracy and attribution, and that if the firm had a policy, I would be happy to send a tidy note with my timeline and a few files to make sure everything lined up, and while I was speaking Vanessa reached under the edge of the table and pinched the inside of my arm with a pressure that said shut up right now. But I kept my voice even and my sentence steady because I had already decided that my days of swallowing things to keep the peace were over. He asked for my email, and I gave it, and he asked whether I had documentation of when the dataset was created and when I had shared a sample, and I said yes, because I have always saved drafts to a neutral account with clear dates and boring file names that look like overkill until the day they become a lifeline. And I added that I had written to Vanessa a month earlier, in a message that was kind and short, asking that if any of my analysis helped her team, she should disclose that fact and give basic credit, and I never received a reply, although the read receipt said the message had been opened the same afternoon, which is a small detail that becomes a large one once you put it next to a client slide that mirrors your work right down to a stray letter. My mother tried to glide in with a soft plea for calm and kindness and not ruining the night, and I told her I was calm, that kindness and clarity are not enemies, and that I was not ruining anything, I was cleaning it. And I looked at Vanessa and said I was not asking for an apology or a scene, I was asking for the truth to go where it belongs. Because I had carried too many lies on my back in the name of family harmony, and I was done playing the quiet half of a duo that only worked if I disappeared on cue. Vanessa whispered that I would not dare escalate this, that I would embarrass myself, that I would regret it, and I heard myself answer with a steadiness that surprised even me, that I would rather regret speaking than regret staying small for the rest of my life. And that if a firm cares about integrity, a clean record helps everyone, and if a firm does not, that is useful information for future choices. Mr. Carroll slipped his card into my hand with a nod that read as permission to follow through. The guests began pretending to restart their conversations even as they leaned closer to hear. My father stared at the tracked changes like they were hieroglyphs that finally translated into something he should have known years ago, and I felt the ground settle under my feet in a way that told me I had crossed a line I could not and would not walk back. Because once you name the truth in a room that was built to keep you quiet, it is impossible to go back to silence and still recognize yourself. Vanessa drew a breath like she was going to deliver a final performance that would flip the narrative back to her, but before she could, my phone lit up with a new message from an address I did not recognize. The subject line short and clipped in the way corporate emails always are, and when I opened it and saw the request for a brief call to discuss external attribution on a recent presentation, I felt Vanessa's fingers dig into my arm again. And I looked at her and said, clearly enough that only the first row of guests could hear, that this was me daring, and if she wanted to know whether I would follow through, she could sit down and watch. The email that arrived during the party did not feel like a bomb going off so much as a door quietly opening onto a hallway I had known existed, but had never walked down. And while the guests tried to restart their small talk and Vanessa pretended to laugh at a joke no one had told, I excused myself to the side of the room, read the message twice to make sure I was not projecting hope onto plain text, and replied with a short confirmation that I could speak first thing the next morning. Attaching the single page I had prepared weeks earlier that listed the timeline, the file names, the dates, and the earlier note I had sent to Vanessa asking for disclosure and basic credit if my work had been helpful. Because I was not going to allow this to turn into a he said, she said situation when I had clean lines and boring details that could stand on their own feet without my voice propping them up. When I slipped the phone back into my bag, I returned to the center of the room with the same steady expression I had walked in with, and I watched as the shape of the evening changed around me, because even the people who wanted to look away could feel the current moving. And in that current my mother tried once again to coax me into letting it go for the sake of the celebration, and I told her quietly that I was not destroying anything. I was finally refusing to hold up a wall that had been leaning on me for years, and that if the party could only survive by pretending I did not exist, then the problem was not my voice. It was the story everyone had agreed to repeat. Vanessa attempted to pivot us back into her narrative by announcing a toast about family success, introducing me as proof of her leadership, and hinting at some vague accomplishment she planned to share later in the evening. Yet even as she lifted her glass, I could see the guests glancing at each other with the alertness people get when a headline has shifted and they are not sure what the new headline is, and I made a choice that felt both small and enormous at the same time, which was to take out my phone again, snap a simple photo of the honors cords draped over my shoulders against a blank background, and post a short message that said, in the most neutral tone I could summon, that I was grateful to have graduated with honors while working full-time, that the adult program had been the hardest and best decision I had made in years, and that I was thankful to the Scholarship Foundation and to Professor Hale for pushing me through the finish line, with no tagging of family, no shade, no names, nothing pointed, just the facts placed where they belonged rather than trapped in the quiet corners of our living room. I put the phone away and did not check it for a while, because I did not want to turn the night into a scoreboard. But I did notice that within a few minutes someone at the foundation reposted the note with a short congratulations to me and a link to their page that listed award recipients. And almost immediately one of Vanessa's acquaintances who manages a community group commented that she had no idea I had been in the program and that the balancing act of work and school was no joke, and that comment, tossed out by someone who barely knew me, did more to rearrange the atmosphere than any argument I could have made, because it set a baseline that was not about family drama but about respect for effort, which is the one currency even the most image-conscious people have trouble arguing against when receipts are on the table. The shift was not dramatic. It was slow and visible and a little awkward, with small groups forming and reforming as people recalibrated what they thought they knew. And in that awkwardness, I noticed Vanessa texting with the ferocity of someone trying to get ahead of a story, her jaw tight in the way she gets when charm is not working and pressure is the only tool left. And when the party finally thinned and the last guest kissed the air near her cheek and left, the house settled into that brittle quiet that comes after a performance, and I thanked my parents for hosting and told them I would see them soon, and I walked out with Evan, who had kept his promise to let me carry my own plan without stepping in to rescue me, because he understands that a rescue can sometimes look like another hand on your steering wheel even when it is offered with love. We drove home with the windows up and the radio off because I needed silence to confirm to myself that I had not imagined the steadiness I felt, and when I finally checked my phone, there was a message from the foundation's public account congratulating me again. A direct note from a classmate who had recognized my chords and asked if I would speak to next year's group about finishing strong, and a small flood of supportive replies that were not sentimental but were specific in a way that told me they had seen the same old pattern tonight and were relieved to witness it crack, and as simple as it sounds, those specific words mattered more to me than the numbers ever would, because metrics fall off, but truth laid down in plain language has a way of staying put. At a little past midnight, my phone rang with Vanessa's name on the screen, and I let it go to voicemail, because I wanted to hear the shape of her words before I gave her mine. And when I pressed play, her voice came through sharp and breathless as she accused me of humiliating her, of hijacking her evening, of making her look like a thief in front of her boss. And she demanded that I delete my post and send a message to Mr. Carroll calling the whole thing a misunderstanding, and there was a pause where I could hear her swallow, and then she said the part that revealed what she truly feared, which was that the image was slipping and that the image was where her safety lived. I called her back and told her, slowly and without heat, that I would not delete a factual post expressing gratitude for my own work and support, and that I had not called her a thief. That I had done nothing more than answer a policy question with documents and respond to a professional inquiry with a timeline, and that if honesty was humiliation, then the problem was not the words, it was the behavior that made those words sting. And I ended the call before the conversation could spiral into the old performance where she cried and I apologized for things that were not mine to carry. A few minutes later, Evan, who had been quiet the entire time, told me that protecting my peace did not require me to turn off my empathy, but that empathy did not require me to walk back into a fire to prove I could stand the heat. And while I was weighing that simple truth, a new ding landed in Vanessa's thread with a forwarded email from her corporate address, and even without opening the attachment, I recognized the template, because it was the same kind of request I had received earlier. A formal invitation to clarify attribution on a recent presentation and to confirm whether any external analysis had informed internal work, and as the clock moved past 1, I realized the hallway I had stepped into was longer than I had first imagined, and that there were more doors ahead, and I understood that walking it would not be comfortable, But that comfort and integrity had not shared a house in our family for a very long time, and I was finally choosing the one that would allow me to recognize myself when the lights came back on. By the time the week drew to a close, I had stopped waiting for Vanessa to change her approach and had accepted that the only change coming was the one I chose to make for myself, because for the first time in my life I had walked through a conflict with her without retreating. And although it left me exhausted, it also left me with a clarity I had not known was possible. The email from her company's HR department came through as promised, polite but precise, asking me to confirm the timeline of my capstone dataset, to provide copies of the files I had shared, and to forward the message I had sent to Vanessa a month earlier, the one in which I had asked only for basic acknowledgement if she used my work in her professional setting. I replied with everything they requested, attaching the original drafts, the tracked edits, the email with the read receipt, and a one-page note summarizing the chronology without commentary, because I wanted the documents to speak louder than any emotion could. 2 days later, I received a short follow-up thanking me for my cooperation and informing me that the firm would be reviewing the situation internally. There was no mention of outcomes, no promises of action, only the kind of measured language corporations use when they are protecting themselves while gathering facts. Yet, even in that careful phrasing, I could read between the lines that they had found enough weight in my files to treat the matter as more than a family quarrel. It was not about me taking them down, it was about them covering their own reputation, and the truth is that was all I needed, because once a company knows your name in connection with data, you cannot be erased as easily as you can be inside a living room argument. The night after that, my parents called and asked me to meet them for dinner, and I knew before I sat down what the conversation would be, because they have always played the role of mediators who plead for calm rather than judges who weigh fairness. They told me Vanessa was distraught, that she felt attacked, that I should let the matter drop before it escalated, and they leaned on that old family phrase about not airing dirty laundry in public. I listened patiently, because I had grown tired of fighting them as much as I had grown tired of fighting her, and when they finished I told them clearly that there would be no reversal this time, that the pattern of me apologizing after being wronged was finished, and that they were free to support whichever daughter they chose, but I would not go back to being the invisible one. The silence that followed was long and uncomfortable, and yet I felt calm, because it was the first time I had said the words out loud without hedging. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened at Vanessa's company. Mr. Carroll reached out directly to me, not with threats or accusations, but with a straightforward offer. He said that if I was open to it, they would compensate me with a consulting fee for the use of my dataset, and they would acknowledge my contribution in future materials connected to that project. It was not a life-changing sum of money, but it was real, and it was clean, and it was exactly the kind of validation I had been denied for years. I accepted, not because I needed their approval, but because it felt like drawing a line in ink across a page that had always been erased before I could write on it. When I told my parents about the arrangement, my mother asked me to please reconsider, to decline the payment and protect Vanessa's job, and my father said that families should not involve outsiders in their disputes. I looked at both of them and explained that this was not a family dispute anymore, that it became professional the moment Vanessa put my work into a client presentation, and that shielding her from consequences was no longer my responsibility. They did not like my answer, but for once they had no leverage, because I was not asking their permission, and I was not seeking their blessing. The final piece of the puzzle came in a way I had not even anticipated. Years earlier, my father had added my name to a small savings account as a precaution, telling me it was for emergencies, and then forgetting about it. After everything with Vanessa unfolded, he reminded me of that account, almost sheepishly, and told me that I could use the funds for something meaningful now that I had closed this chapter. I withdrew the money and used it to pay for a professional certificate program that would build on my degree and move me forward in my career. I kept the receipt, not because I needed to prove anything to him, but because I wanted a record for myself. A reminder that the resources of the family were finally invested in my future rather than drained into Vanessa's endless narrative of needing more attention. The news about Vanessa's performance review trickled back through the family in fragments. She was not fired, but she was asked to address questions about attribution and to complete additional compliance training. For someone who built her identity around being untouchable, the fact that she was even questioned was enough to rattle her. I did not celebrate her stress, because that was never the point. The point was that for once the truth existed in a space she could not control with charm or denial. When she finally texted me a week later, it was a single line that revealed everything. "If I admit it, do you make it go away?" I stared at the words for a long time before I realized that she still thought the power lay in my ability to forgive or erase, when in reality the power had shifted because I no longer needed her admission to validate my worth. I did not reply, not because I wanted to punish her, but because the silence said more than any crafted message could. I had already won the only victory that mattered. I had chosen self-respect over silence, truth over performance, and a future that belonged to me rather than to the version of me my sister had always tried to script. And so the story ends not with a dramatic confrontation or a collapse, but with a quiet certainty that I will never again stand in a corner while someone else rewrites my life in real time. The party that was supposed to showcase Vanessa's triumph became the night she lost her monopoly on the family narrative, and the night I finally stepped into the role that had always been mine to claim. I broke the rule she set when she told me not to outshine her, and in doing so I discovered that shining does not require permission, it requires proof, and I had plenty of that, more than enough to carry me into whatever comes next.